Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name's Motoyuki.
I'm Dr. Paul Kalnins. Welcome to Enliven
Enliven Medicine. Great. On today's episode, we'll be putting on a cool set of glasses known as the four ethers, which will help us see plant, animal, and human physiology with new eyes. Before we get started today, first a question from one of our viewers, Jess Brown, who says, "Hi, Dr. Kalnins." Jess Brown in Portland, Oregon. And she is curious about the effects of current technology on the evolution or devolution of consciousness.
So I have just a couple minutes to answer that question. That's a big question. So I've kind of laid out this idea that, consciousness is something that it continuously evolves. So the consciousness we used 2,000 years ago is very different, of course, than what we use today. And today we have very much the intellectual analytical consciousness that's exemplified in the scientific method and our current scientific approaches. That kind of method tends to have a certain effect upon physiology. And we hinted at that last time, talking about how if we look at our three fundamental physiological processes, the nerve sensory, the metabolic, and the rhythmic that mediates between those two, a lot of the technologies and whatnot that we have out there are really emphasizing the nerve sensory forces. They get us in our head and our brain. They don't use the muscles as much. We don't use our metabolism. And if we really take that nerve sensory process to an extreme, what we find is a tendency towards hardening, towards sclerosis, coldness in the body. So in a way, our modern technology from one angle is inducing forces of crystallization, mineralization within us, not just physiologically, but also in our thinking. Because we become a little bit less able to form mental images, to really work with them fluidly. We have them given to us as images already created. We live in these artificial realities now, in a sense. And so that emphasizes a certain aspect of our physiology. Again, the end result of that sort of takes us more towards hardening and sclerosis. And that can play out into the kinds of illnesses we see, more cold, chronic, sub-inflammatory or autoimmune, cancer, those kinds of things can be looked at upon as an extension of those hardening forces. So that would be one problem we're seeing with technology. One little last point on that is that, technology is based on the digital zeros and ones. And there is no room for the mediating, the middle element. And so in a sense, we have a polarity without the mediation. And that's what we see in our culture. Schisms. You think this, you think that, there's nothing in between. There's no gray area. So that would be another, I think, a deeper aspect of that.
Wow.
All right.
All right. You still have
your timing.
But that's a deep thought for all of us. So
that's a seed maybe for another whole lecture right there.
Yeah. Well, that's wow. All right. Dr. Paul Kalnins, everyone. Let's get started.
What have we kind of looked at so far? I just want to back up and say, why are we doing this? What's the whole purpose of these kinds of talks? And, what's kind of behind this is this idea that our current thinking, which is largely based in what we might call scientific consciousness or intellectual thinking, although very powerful, has its limits. It's not able to grasp very well whole systems, complex systems of interaction and whatnot. And so as a result of that, the application of that thinking to medicine, to education, farming, to architecture, how we design cities, creates a certain type of world which is not necessarily one that we have to live with. We can expand that thinking. And especially in areas like holistic medicine, there are a lot of people who claim to be holistic medicine practitioners, and this is no way to offend any holistic medicine practitioners, but a lot of times the thinking that goes into so-called holistic medicine is really just an extension of that scientific thinking, and we use maybe natural remedies and things like that. So we diagnose disease in the same way and think about disease in the same way, but it's really no different than the current paradigm. So we have this paradigm, the scientific consciousness paradigm, which is very much focused in, again, intellectual consciousness and materialism. Everything starts with matter and energy. So we start from the parts and we build up the whole. Can we develop a science that would meet all the criteria of science that starts with the whole and goes down into the parts? How do we start with the organizing wholes and then move into the parts? There's a very interesting image in embryology. The first fertilized cell, the zygote, when the egg and the sperm come together, when it grows in the first week or so, it actually doesn't grow very large. It actually grows in terms of number of cells by division. So you start with a whole and you divide into 2 to 4 to 8 and so forth. So it's a division process starting from the whole down. That's not how, for example, minerals work. They build by building up. You start with one piece, you add on another, you add on another. And so it's a building up process. So in the living world, right there, it's showing us that we need a different way of thinking that starts with wholes and is able to go down into parts versus starting with the parts to build up the whole. And so all of this is really around that question, can we develop a way of doing that? And when we do that, we start to see that a lot of traditional practices, traditional medicines, actually were doing that. They were bringing that way of thinking. And can we use that way of thinking and apply it to modern science to really extend it so that no longer do we have to limit science to just studying matter, but we can also look at what we might call supersensory phenomena, the activities in life, in your psychology or psyche, as well as what we might call your thought world, connected maybe more to a greater spiritual realm. We've talked a bit about how thoughts can be viewed as living things, archetypes. We also have feeling archetypes and living form archetypes. And they can be grasped through an enlivened thinking. And so I introduced this notion from the Austrian philosopher Rudolf Steiner that we can expand our consciousness beyond intellectual cognition to grasp fluidic processes, and that would be the imaginative cognition, to grasp processes more in our feeling life, and that would be the inspirative or feeling cognition, and to grasp processes in our thought life, and that would be the intuitive cognition. We sort of intuit thoughts. And again, when I mean thoughts, I don't mean dead intellectual thoughts, but living thoughts. We might call intuitive thinking more thinking from the heart. So it's combining feeling with thinking. It's enlivening thinking to a deeper level. So when we look at those 4 modes of observing and apply that to a human being, as we've talked about in the previous little episodes, there are 4 levels of organization that become apparent that we need to look at more closely in medicine. The physical organization, which is what we usually study in medicine, which is your structures, organs, and whatnot. And that is subject to, we might call it the mineral body. It's subject to physical laws. So when you study a corpse, you use the same kind of thinking to study the corpse as you use to study minerals. You can look at what the pieces are, how they fit together, and then we try to reduce it down. And we look at living tissue, we try to reduce that down to solids, the genes, the molecules, and whatnot. So we're always trying to reduce everything down to the solid with our scientific consciousness. And that is able to grasp the mineral very well. So we can explain minerals from those parts. And from the mineral consciousness, we see that in nature, there are 4 primary forces. There's gravity, gravitational forces, there's electromagnetic forces, and then what are called the strong and weak nuclear forces. So 4 physical forces. And physics and chemistry say that's all. There's no 5th magic life force. There's nothing, that's it. That's all you need to explain the world. And again, that applies very well to minerals. Also, I'll just say one other thing about physical forces is they're subject to entropy. They tend towards disorder. So minerals fall apart over time. They tend to have greater disorder, and that's entropy. And we release heat into the environment, and gradually, the fate of the universe, according to physics, is the great heat death. Eventually, all the heat will be out there, uncapturable. We won't be able to use it for work in any way or to move things. So basically, the world will come to an end. The universe will come to an end. That's the great heat death. So that's the view from physical sciences, which is more and more applied to biology and psychology and other areas. So we try to reduce the psyche to neurotransmitters and nerves and things like that. when we jump up and go from minerals to plants, if you look at a plant, there are, of course, mineral processes in there. We can reduce it to ash. We can study the minerals. What's the chemical composition? But there's also an additional level of organization above the mineral. There are forces that maintain the plant against entropy. So instead of falling apart, the plant takes the minerals from the soil and brings it to a higher level of organization. Now, in the scheme of things, the plant is taking energy in and excreting energy. So the whole entropy of the system actually tends towards more disorganization. But within the plant, at least, we have all this organization. And we have this energy that's exchanged and it's captured, in photosynthesis, and we fix the carbon into the sugars and whatnot. So brilliant processes that are happening here that you don't see in the mineral world. Using the same elements, so there are 4 basic elements of life: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen. Throw in some phosphorus and sulfur and then some of the other trace minerals and whatnot, and you have life. So, those minerals of life are the same in minerals and plants, but in plants, they're taken to a higher level of organization. The physicist Erwin Schrödinger wrote a book called What is Life? And he talked about how life, this is back in the 1930s, 40s, really has this, what he called a negentropic quality, negative entropy. It opposes entropy. And with life, you, of course, need not just solids, but also a fluid. You need a fluidic existence. There are rhythms in the sap and whatnot that are going on there. So in the fluid, we say the fluid is open to the environment and is able to absorb in influences that a closed system can't. So the fluid is now being put into a new space. And that's a whole beautiful discussion on water right now. There's actually a lot of, not a lot, but there are a few researchers that are studying water in biological systems. And you find that water, normally we think of it as ice, solid, liquid water, and gas, vapor. But in areas where there are charged surfaces, like charged proteins in the body, it takes on a 4th state, a colloid state. And in that state, it has new properties. It stores up electrical charge. It can absorb infrared radiation from the environment and store it like a battery, a water battery within your tissues. And there's a Gerald Pollack, who's up at the University of Washington. He's an engineer. He studied this very in detail. He's written some beautiful books about it. But the idea that the water organization takes on a level that's very different than your mineral organization. And that organization is what Rudolf Steiner called the etheric body, if you look at that as a whole. And that within that body, there are additional forces. Now, these forces are very different than the 4 I mentioned: gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces. They are not like those forces at all. They're as if coming from a different space. We'd say today they're arising from the vacuum. So it's like the life can tap into the vacuum to pull these forces, which are different than physical energies. They are more organizing. And that's an important concept. And that's why historically those forces have been called vital forces. But in the 1800s, scientists began to try to measure these. Is there a 5th force in nature? And they realized, no, we don't need to explain chemistry, for example, or biochemistry by invoking these vital forces. In fact, if you open up any biochemistry textbook today, usually on the 2nd page, it says there are no vital forces. And there was an experiment done by Friedrich Wöhler, who was a biochemist in the 1820s. And he synthesized, it was thought at that time, that organic molecules can only be made within living organisms. And one example of an organic molecule is urea. So urea, that's in your urine, it's the byproduct of protein metabolism. Wöhler actually synthesized it in a test tube from inorganic ammonium salts. So he just took ammonium nitrate, heated it, he made urea. And he's like, look, you don't need a living organism to make this. So from that point on, chemists began to think there's nothing special about living organisms. Biochemistry is just an extension of regular chemistry. And that's how we study it today. So it's ironic in naturopathic schools where they talk about these so-called vital forces, they talk about the so-called vis medicatrix naturae, which is what they refer to in ancient Greece as these vital forces. In naturopathic school, you learn biochemistry in your first semester, And the very first thing you read is there are no vital forces. And so the whole rest of the program is like, well, there are no vital forces, then how do we fit that back in to the equation? We talk about all these other topics and homeopathy and whatnot, but that's almost seen as separate from biochemistry. And then you create this schism in your thinking. And that's a real problem right now, is that we have the materialist mechanists who say there's no vital forces, that's ridiculous, and the vitalists who say there's vital forces. And I think they're both wrong, actually. And Steiner, I think, paved a way to showing us how we can resolve that dilemma, to say that the so-called vital forces are not forces like electricity or magnetism or whatnot, but they are organizing influences that come into the fluidic body, and they're as if arising from a polar kind of space. And that's why we can't measure them with physical instruments, but we can see their effects within matter. And that's why living forms take on different shapes than or inorganic forms. And that would be what he called the etheric forces. The etheric forces, as we'll see as we go along, also are guided by higher organizing forces that he called etheric formative forces. And they actually arise more from a different space entirely. And this is what in Chinese medicine we call the 5 phases. Actually, in the anthroposophic sense, there were 7 forces. So 5, and then the sun and the moon forces act in there as well. And so that's a whole different discussion for the 7. And then even more distally are 12 additional organizing forces from the zodiac. So we have 12, 7, and then down at the etheric level, 4 forces. And these forces were, Steiner described them as being counter images to physical matter. So in ancient thinking, in ancient Greece, they talked about physical matter in physical space using the language of the 4 elements. So earth represented the solid element, water, the fluidic, air, the gaseous, and then fire, the warmth element in nature. They perceive warmth as an actual element, not just kinetic energy. We'd say it's kinetic energy today as well. So earth, water, air, and fire were 4 divisions of the physical world. Aristotle proposed that there was a 5th element. He called that the quintessence, that doesn't arise from the earth. It comes from the cosmos, from the stars and the planets and whatnot. And that this force needed to be captured by living organisms for them to become alive. And that's exactly what Steiner is referring to here as the etheric forces, etheric activity. Each of the 4 elements captures a unique ether, or a unique ether can work through that element. So in the case of the solid element, there is an ether, and we can think of these as like morphogenic. There's a term called the morphogenic field. And this is Rupert Sheldrake, is a biologist who came up with this. Each element, earth, water, air, fire, has its own morphogenic field. So the morphogenic field of the solid would be what Rudolf Steiner referred to as the life ether. And that really brings about in living organisms the 3-dimensional structure of the organism. So that's the information that's encoded within the genetic information, and that helps to form the solid features of an organism, the life ether. In the water element, there is a morphogenic field, which works more not 3-dimensionally, but 2-dimensionally in planes. What we see, for example, in leaves, which are just planes, planar surfaces. These planar surfaces, this ether organizes, structures the water. He called this the chemical tone ether, because he intuited that there was a relationship to music here. And this is really interesting to look at chemistry to show that actually chemistry is really based on musical principles, right? The whole periodic table is based on the octave. And so that musical forces, sound forces imbued into water create structures. A really good way of visualizing that is there was, people might have seen the physicist, I believe 1700s, Ernst Chladni. He created these plates of metal. He put lycopodium spores or sand on them, and then he used a violin bow to bow the plate, and it vibrated. and the grains of the sand with the lycopodium spores create these beautiful structures. You can look that up online. That's been taken into a modern form into something called cymatics. And so just go on YouTube and you see people who have put these speakers and put a plate on it and then sand and vibrated at different frequencies, the plate, and it forms structures in the sand that look like cells at different frequencies. So we can think of a cellular structure or a planar structure in a tissue as really a consolidation of those tonal forces, those musical forces. So that would be the second ether, the chemical tone ether.
For listeners, if they wanted to find like the direct connection between the musical, the octave, and the periodic table, would they find that just looking up cymatics, or is there like a resource that?
So that was actually, if you look at a lot of even more conventional, that is in chemistry. If you take out the transition metals, you have eight electrons in your, going above hydrogen and helium, you have 8 electrons in your valence shell. And that's the octave. So when you complete the octave, for example, in the inert gases, then you have a complete octave. But that idea was back in the 1800s. Chemists were beginning to realize that octave principle. And but it's something that if you just Googled periodic table in the octave, you'd probably find a lot of information on that. Yeah. So that shows you one of these organizing structural ideas, archetypes in the world. And that's what Steiner called the chemical tone ether. So that organizes water, the fluid element. So it brings dead water into life. And so that's an interesting idea, to think that water can be dead and it can be living. Living water is as if connected with these etheric forces. And so when something dies, the etheric forces leave and the water falls into a dead state. And that brings up all sorts of interesting ideas about, how do we recharge water? And essentially, if you study nature, you find that nature's doing that through things like creating vortices. So the tumbling of water down a river, forming vortex formations, it's as if recharging the water with etheric activity. And, living organisms do that too. So plants are taking that. And again, water in that colloidal state is able to absorb information that normal water, so-called dead water, can't. And so colloidal water would be more like living water in that sense. So that's the second pairing, the organizing ether and then water element. The third element would be gas. And Steiner argued that gas itself is organized by its own ether in living organisms. And he called this the light ether. And light ether basically is, it's more one-dimensional. Think of a ray of light. It opens up spaces. And so, if you go into the darkness of night, you find there's no space. It's like space disappears. So in a way, light has this spatial organizing effect to our consciousness and to our normal visual consciousness. And so again, this is using more of that phenomenological kind of language. But light itself is something that, and when he meant light, he meant this living light, which is actually invisible to the normal senses. And I alluded to that last time in Goethe's color theory, how light itself is not visible unless it's reflected off of matter. And then we form colors. But true light is actually something that Steiner referred to as a supersensory process. And he was very clear that it's much more than just an electromagnetic wave. That's the current notion in physics, that light is just an electromagnetic wave traveling in the vacuum of space. There was for a while, people proposed there was an ether that it was traveling in, and they got rid of the ether for a number of reasons. They didn't need it for the explanations. But in a way, light itself, Steiner called the electromagnetic light the corpse of living light. In fact, when light falls into matter, Steiner argued that this creates electrical forces. So electricity is actually what he called fallen light ether, which is a very interesting idea, that modern technologies that try to create more and more electricity are actually trapping more and more light ether into matter, which he argued is actually a detrimental thing for human evolution. That's a very deep topic right there. that we're actually enslaving light into a realm that it should not be in. So it makes us question, even wind and solar is still making electricity. It's still trapping light ether. And the question is that the best way to run our society? As a little side topic, I'll say that, these ideas about the ether and ether forces really begin to suggest a new type of technology. And I'll come back to that because I think that's an important one to talk about here. So that's the light ether is an organizing principle within the gaseous element. And within human beings, there is evidence of inner light. So there's this whole area known as biophoton research. Our cells are constantly emitting light. In fact, mitochondria generate light all the time. And for a long time, chemists thought it was just a byproduct of chemical reactions. So anytime you have a chemical reaction, energy is released, and some of that's in the form of light, some of that's in the form of heat. And it was thought that light was just, disorganized chemical activity. But there was a physicist, Fritz Albert Popp, who demonstrated that light is coherent, like a laser light. So the wavelengths are overlapping, meaning that it's actually not random light. It's actually being used by cells as intelligible physiologic information. Cells are communicating through light. And where that light is really carried in the body is through specific structures. Specifically within cells, we have this like protein scaffolding called the cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton is made up of what's called tubulin, which is a protein that forms essentially a hollow tube. And if you calculate the inner diameter of that tube, it's actually perfect to be a fiber optic cable. So our cells have fiber optic cables, and they're collecting light information from the mitochondria and potentially the nucleus and distributing that throughout the cell and then between cells through the extracellular tissues. So Popp and others developed all these cameras to be able to take pictures of this subtle inner light activity. And in fact, one of his hypotheses that started his research is that there has to be this inner light frequency, which he calculated to be around the ultraviolet range, present in cells, and that if that frequency gets disturbed, we start seeing cancers. That frequency keeps cells from growing, keeps them in check. And his research looked at specific carcinogens, compounds that cause cancer, and how they are light-absorbing compounds at exactly that frequency. So his theory was that these carcinogens absorbed that light and blocked it from the cells. And that's how they're carcinogenic. And so the cells don't get the light information to hold them into effect. That light is everywhere, but where it really concentrates, again, is through microtubules. And where you see a lot of microtubules are in neurons, nerve cells. So there are some interesting theories of consciousness right now that are looking at the fact that nerve action potentials, that's the normal electrical activity in nerves, is too slow to actually account for consciousness. It's just too slow. And so there has to be a second signaling system within nerves. And one proposal is that it's the light through the little fiber optic microtubule cables that's actually acting in the brain as a giant light computer, basically. And that increases the computational power and whatnot of the brain millionfold. So that's an interesting emerging theory of consciousness, is where consciousness is based on light and light processes, not on material physical processes as much. Curiously, neurotransmitters, the majority of them are what are called biogenic amines, like serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine. In nature, these are some of the most light absorbent molecules out there. So curiously, our organism chose evolutionarily these very specific molecules as neurotransmitters. And so that seems like there's a connection with light going on here. In fact, the argument I've heard is that the neurotransmitters, one hypothesis, is that they actually slow the light down so we can have thinking. Otherwise, we'd have superluminal thinking and all these kinds of things. So that's kind of interesting take on neurotransmitters. They don't create our thinking. They actually slow the light down so that we can think. Kind of a different take on things.
Oh, I wonder, let's say, I mean, this is a hot topic nowadays, like psychedelics and, like
yeah.
LSD, for example, or psilocybin, they're known to increase serotonin. in the brain. And, you know, scientists back in the day would form these giant think tanks where they'd all take like a, you know, 200 micrograms of LSD, and they think about these scientific issues and come up with solutions to some of the most intractable kind of issues that society was facing.
Yeah. And I think that shows you that these psychedelic molecules, psilocybin, LSD, and dimethyltryptamine, DMT, all these things, they are interacting with our light organism. In fact, the experience you have, you know, if you do mushrooms or LSD is inner light. You see patterns and images, and that's how in our thinking, we're using light as a basis of our thinking. So they're all interacting with the light body in specific ways. We can say that, you know, psilocybin and mushrooms tuned you to a specific aspect of the light. And we can get into this later, but that light itself is originating from, again, the light ether, which on a higher level is coming also from the astral world. So we're tuning ourselves in the astral world to very specific regions and very specific beings in the astral world. And so that's where the insights from LSD are very different maybe than from dimethyltryptamine. A deeper question then is, okay, what beings are you tuning yourself to? And are you aware of that? And do you know what you're doing? And, you know, that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah, and then I think the next question then that maybe we're naturally leading to before, you know, is it's like, what is the effect of meditation or some of these more spiritual practices on this light ether, or maybe our receptivity to it?
In general, although the light ether is a part of the etheric body, you can say it is the carrier in the etheric of the astral and the consciousness forces. So it's the reflection of the consciousness forces down into the etheric, the fluid. In fact, that merging of the light with the fluid, the light ether with the tone ether, is exactly what in Chinese medicine has been referred to as qi. So qi would be essentially the light ether and tone ether activity. For simplification, we can call it liquid light. We can just say it's more has a light quality, so we can tie that in with the light ether. So that's an important concept there, is that, you know, that light ether carries consciousness into the etheric, and it carries the archetypes of consciousness, which really relate back to, in the ancient thinking, to those planetary archetypes. And so we'll get to that. But that's, for example, where there's a Mars light ether, a Jupiter-like light ether. In Chinese medicine, the Mars light ether was called fire. That was the fire phase. In fact, this is a very important concept. In Chinese medicine, we have the notion of the so-called 5 elements. They're actually in Chinese, you know, the Wu Xing. They're 5 processes, activities, not elements. In fact, that is a major mistranslation. They are not the same as those 4 elements on the physical plane, nor are they the same as the 4 ethers. They are actually coming from a higher space, the astral, reflected into the ether. And so that's why there's actually 5. And if you really look at it, there's 7. So water divides into 2, and then the fire phase divides into 2. And that relates in the ancient thinking to the 7 planets of the solar system. They looked at Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Mercury, Venus, Moon. And so in a way, we can say the astral world reflects through the planetary spheres and physical space. That reflects down into the light ether. And then we see qi flowing around, and that is carrying these archetypes in a sense. So this gives us, and I know it probably sounds abstract to a lot of people, but if you really work with these images, you start to find, oh, okay, this is a light ether process versus this is a chemical tone ether process. And we start to get ideas to think about that. And hopefully we have some time here where I can apply that to chemistry and how we can look at the actual chemistry as a reflection of those ethers. So I got up to the light ether in the air gaseous element. But there's one more, and that's the warmth element. And that is the closest to its own ether. So it's trying to refer to as a warmth ether that enlivens warmth. And I think that's an important concept, that you can have dead warmth. So if you sit in an infrared sauna, that's dead warmth. But the warmth that it stimulates within you, so again, in the sauna, it's not that you're absorbing that heat into you. That's a very, I think, incorrect notion. anything from the outside, let's say from the ethers, has to be in a way resisted and transformed before it comes into you. And we'll look at that maybe more deeply later in terms of food, that the outer activities in food have to actually come to a standstill within you, and then you have to rebuild it up into living food that imbues your own living forces. So in a way, when you're in that sauna, the dead heat stimulates a process in you which activates within you warmth ether. And that activity is directly related to what I refer to as your I, your ego self, the sense of your spiritual self, which in Chinese medicine would be say it's the Shen. That's related to more yang forces in that way. So in a sense, this warmth in the environment is largely dead warmth, even like moxibustion. Now, moxa's, I think, a little bit, for those who don't know what moxibustion is, you take the type of wormwood and you burn it over the skin. And, the idea is that it's adding heat causes, hyperemia in the skin, vasodilation that brings in more blood flow and more waste exchange. And so it helps speed up healing in different tissues. But we can say that the moxa applied to the skin, comes to the skin, it's resisted, and it activates within you warmth ether forces. And that's actually a very important concept we'll get to. Our current ideas in like pharmacology are that a drug comes into you and does something. That's one way of thinking from a physical, material angle. But from this way of thinking, a drug comes into you, it has to be transformed, and then it awakens an opposite process, which is what heals you. And that's known as hormesis, that low doses can awaken a physiologic process. And this is the basis of what's called salutogenesis, supporting the conditions of health, not treating pathology. So we have anti-inflammatories, antimicrobials, et cetera. The anti-approach is the get it into you. But the opposite approach would be say, well, no, we take this medicine because it stimulates my liver, let's say the chemical tone ether in my liver to work differently. So now it can detox better. And that's a whole different way of thinking that even natural health practitioners, I think, forget, because we so much want to take the modern pharmacologic view that outer thing is causing the healing effect. It's not like that at all. It has to awaken an ether within you. So in the case of heat, it's awakening that. Light from the outside is awakening light within you, and that's what's healing you. So that's a very different approach, and that's, again, much more aligned with these terrain-based approaches that we've been talking about. So 4 elements, earth, water, air, fire, in living organisms have to be imbued by an ether to bring them to life. So that would be the life ether for the solid, the chemical tone ether for the fluidic, which works more two-dimensionally, light ether for the gases within you, related more to consciousness forces, and that's more one-dimensional. And then the warmth ether, which works more through time, is related to your higher spiritual body, the Shen or the I ego body in the sense of anthroposophic thinking. So those are the 4 ethers and the 4 elements, very different. So Aristotle said there's one ether, quintessence. Rudolf Steiner divided them into 4. He said actually that one has 4 aspects, and each element needs its own. And again, those ethers are organized by an even higher level of order, which is where the wuxing, the 5 phases in Chinese medicine, or the planetary forces in alchemical medicine come in. And Steiner called those etheric formative forces. Now, a lot of anthroposophists I found confuse ethers and etheric formative forces, but if you read closely between the lines, he's actually talking about 2 different things. That's created a lot of confusion, I think. But these can be studied. We can study the water structures in the cells. We can study the biophotons. We can study the rhythms that all these carry through. So I think these are open now to scientific investigation now that they're on the radar screen. Now that we know what to look at, we can begin to explore this in a little bit more depth. But it opens up whole new possibilities. Yeah. One thing I'll say to connect it back to Chinese medicine, because I know we have a lot of viewers in that Chinese medicine world. There are 4, if you look at pathology in Chinese medicine, there are, with any organ, for example, let's say the liver, we talk about how the liver can be in several different states. So we have what's called liver yang, liver qi, liver blood, and liver yin. And that's the case for all the organs. They have a yang aspect, a qi aspect, a blood aspect, and a yin aspect. Now, how does that relate to what I've just been talking about? Well, interestingly, if you really look at what yang means, the yang aspect of an organ, it refers to the inner warmth, metabolism, and that comes largely through the arterial blood flow into an organ and the oxygenation and mitochondrial function. In functional medicine, we call yang deficiency mitochondrial dysfunction. Same thing. So that's the yang force, and that relates very strongly to the warmth ether. So you can say when you talk about the organ yang, you're talking about the warmth ether of that organ. So the liver has a warmth ether, the heart has a warmth ether, the kidney system has a warmth ether, and so forth. So excess would be too much warmth, and that would create inflammations and fever and redness in the face and bounding pulse and things like that. Or deficiency would be a lack of that warmth element, that warmth activity. And again, in the functional medicine world, they would call that mitochondrial dysfunction. And we know that mitochondria are where we make the ATP, and then the muscles in particular are where we make heat through their mitochondria. Both skeletal and cardiac muscle makes most of our heat, and then brown fat makes most of the rest. So that is the warmth yang. Now, qi I talked about, that's the light ether. So we can look at the qi as the light forces within you. So the liver qi would be the light activity in the liver. Now, what is the light activity physiologically? Well, interestingly, I mentioned that the light forces are strongly connected with the nervous system. And the liver has its own nervous system. It has both parasympathetic and sympathetic nerves that go into it, but mostly parasympathetic, vagal fibers. When the vagus fires in the liver, it actually speeds up all the liver activity. It increases detox. It increases, in the case of the parasympathetic, glycogen storage, protein synthesis, fat synthesis, etc. And so the light ether actually drives the physiology. It activates it. And so we can connect that qi part of an organ to its nervous system, to its autonomic nerves. And that allows us to measure all sorts of stuff now, because we have techniques to measure the autonomic nervous system. In fact, when we say we're moving qi around, there's a very strong correlation with that and autonomic nervous system. Again, qi is not just the autonomic nerves, it's the light that flows through them. Yeah, so there's a little difference there. And it's related to those gases that I talked about, nitric oxide and whatnot as well. So that's the qi aspect of an organ. So qi stasis is really a situation usually of excess qi that gets bound up. So we'd say that's like, for example, too much sympathetic activity in the liver. And that causes too much breakdown, too much glycogen breakdown, protein breakdown, and so forth. Qi deficiency would be there would be a lack of those autonomic forces. And so the liver becomes sluggish. It doesn't metabolize as quickly anymore. Everything backs up. And so we get issues there. So that would be one aspect of that. When we describe qi stasis, liver qi stasis, like for example, in PMS, where you have all of these, more pelvic pain and mood swings and all these different things. In a way, we can say that's because the autonomic activity is not regulating the detox activity of hormones in the liver very well. So all the hormones back up. You get too much estrogen relative to progesterone, and that creates a lot of these issues. So that's the qi of the organ. The blood of the organ would be the chemical tone ether. And those forces are really anabolic, rejuvenating. They fall into that whole realm of antioxidants. And, the fact that we can think of liver blood is really being all the glucose and protein and fats the liver puts into the blood, as well as vitamins, but also antioxidants. The liver makes a huge amount of an antioxidant called glutathione, which contributes electrons to the body to quench free radical reactions. So it has a cooling, anti-inflammatory, nourishing effect. That's the blood, the liver blood in that aspect. And then we have the liver yin, which would relate to the life ether. That's the actual physical life activity and structures, the morphogenic field that holds the whole liver together. is its yin aspect. In Chinese pathology, again, when you talk about the liver, you talk about its yang, qi, blood, yin, and those can be either excess or deficient. So with each organ, we have 8 patterns of dysfunction based on the ethers. And what's brilliant about this way of thinking is that we can now identify herbs that can balance each of those processes. So for example, if you look at turmeric has a lot, if you look at where it grows in these tropical, warm, humid climates, it has an intense amount of warmth ether. And it takes that warmth ether down into its roots, and you actually see the orangish roots. That's an image of those fire processes that have been brought down into the roots. So when you take turmeric, it actually activates within different organs the warmth ether activity. In the case of the liver and gallbladder, it actually helps to stimulate the warmth and metabolic activities of the liver and improves bile flow and everything else. It does the same thing in the cardiovascular system, where it increases blood flow into capillary beds, so forth. So again, this is very different than saying turmeric is an anti-inflammatory. This says that turmeric actually treats chronic inflammation by improving more blood flow, effectively actually trying to get more acute inflammation going, although it's very subtle, to heal. So it's activating the warmth in those. So it's very good for the chronic inflammatory patterns of inflammation and pain. It's not going to be as good for your acute patterns. Now it can be, but it's better for the more chronic because you're trying to work with the warmth forces. Versus other herbs like peony root is very rich in starches. It's also very rich in flavonoids. And flavonoids in general have a very strong affinity for the chemical tone ether. And they're antioxidant and whatnot. So in a sense, in the liver, the peony emphasizes the blood aspect. So it nourishes the liver blood. So it has an effect there. So you can begin to see how you can start to now look at all the organs as having these 4 processes. And then again, with excess or deficiency of each, we can have 8 primary pathological patterns with each organ. Yeah. So that's a little intro on the etheric forces. Maybe a new take on so-called vital forces, maybe a little bit more there. It'd be a whole longer discussion about the physical nature of the etheric forces, how we can look at what are called polar Euclidean spaces and how they bring these forces in. I won't get into that here, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that is quite substantial what you've shared with us today. And I think for those of us who are listening, it would be helpful to, if we miss something the first time, since it is so rich in content, to go back through and take notes and really take the time to think about these things, because it is a lot of, there's a lot there.
What I can do next time is go right into chemistry. Look at how carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen actually relate to these 4 forces, and how the actual chemical compounds we see are images of these reflected into matter. And again, that's what I said. You can't measure the etheric forces directly, but you can see their effects in matter and in living organisms. So we can maybe tie this back in later with that deeper discussion on chemistry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that'll be some, maybe even homework for people to start looking at what is it, just these basic elements, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen, and then we have sulfur and
phosphorus. Right. And then, some of your electrolytes like sodium, potassium, calcium, and then trace elements, iron and copper and whatnot. So, if you look at the majority, though, of if we were to take a human body and turn it into ash and then measure the actual chemical elements in there, there are those 4: carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, hydrogen. And I can go in more deeply next time and look at how those 4 are actually carrying into the body those etheric activities. So when we see carbon processes, just as a little clue to that, we're actually seeing the life ether in its activity. And that's why carbon is the basis of organic chemistry, really the life ether forms all of these different structures. But then oxygen is more carrying the life ether, the chemical tone ether. and then nitrogen, the light ether, and then hydrogen, the warmth ether. So we never really got rid of the four elements or four ethers in modern biochemical thinking. We just renamed them. We focused on their solid aspect, which is the actual element or gas or whatever, but we took the life out of the thinking. And that's where we, have forgotten that connection. But it's still there. The thread is still there.
Yeah, and by being able to see kind of the higher organizing forces that are influencing these more basic elements,
Yeah.
we can start to see new connections that maybe we didn't see before. Kind of
Right.
level of understanding.
So when you look at a plant with a lot of volatile oils like the mint family, very rich in what are called monoterpenes and sesquiterpenes, these terpenes are actually just little carbon skeletons that are saturated in hydrogen, fire. So you can say, really, these plants are carrying a fire force. They're carrying the warmth ether. And when we use the mints, we're activating the warmth ether within us. Versus in the carrot family, there's a very strong influence of the light ether. And so when you take in a carrot like bupleurum or fennel or one of these, it's activating the light forces within you in certain organs. So it opens up a whole new way of etheric chemistry and etheric botany that I think gives an additional lens on top of biochemistry and top of traditional pharmacology.
Mm-hmm. So just recap the light ether, then something that activating the light ether, we would think of the nervous system activating.
Work very strongly through the autonomic nerves. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then with the warmth ether, more of the metabolic,
even circulatory forces. Yeah.
Yeah. So even like the blood vessels, arterial blood flow,
especially arterial flow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Versus the chemical tone ether works more through the venous blood and lymph, in interstitial fluids, and all the antioxidant activity there as well. And then the life ether on the actual structure, the connective tissue, the structure of the organ, and how it holds. You might say the stroma of the organ and how it's holding together. So yeah, so they're reflected into these different activities. Yeah.
Great. That's really substantial. I know one of your specialties has been to integrate like all of these perspectives from Chinese medicine, from Western biomedicine, from all
anthroposophic
medicine, the whole gamut of basically informational science available to us. I don't even know if there's anything out there, like if people wanted to like look at these different, like we talked about like 8 different patterns you might see in the liver.
That's well, you see that in the Chinese medicine literature, of course. They don't relate it to the ethers, but they talk about the qi and the blood, the yin and the yang. But there's no book that I've seen that has brought that. But if enough people out there want me to write a book, I can do it. Yeah,
I do know you have like certain courses that might be, available for a really reasonable amount to the public eventually, that maybe.
Yeah, I haven't created them yet, but it's something that if enough people like put in the comments, if you want, something like this, let me know and we can put more of that out there.
Yeah. And then just for anyone listening, feel free to ask like questions. We'll make sure to answer at least one at the beginning of every episode. And also, usually after we close out each episode, we end up having an extended conversation with, more clarifying questions. And that's usually, we're probably going to make some of that subscriber-only content just so we can kind of get paid for the time that we're investing into this. And I guess just, if anyone's interested in that or would be interested in that, just definitely let us know by way of message or comment. But that's all for later. Anyways, is there, I feel like maybe is there anything more for listeners that maybe is important to think about on this particular
I
topic?
mean, I'll just leave here, so we've explored the conceptual base of this, which is the first level, right? But then we have to get into an actual experience of it. That's the more imaginative and the feeling and higher. So, at this stage, to sort of kind of reflect on this, and again, the meditation comparing a mineral with a plant and looking at their similarities, but also their differences, helps to, understand that the plant being imbued with these etheric forces is bringing matter to a different level, and then to try to turn in meditation and see how is that happening within me. Can I actually have an experience of these living forces within me? And I gave the example of how, like in Qigong, you start with the stance in Qigong, the Chinese meditative art, the so-called Chinese yoga, I guess they call it, Taoist yoga. And, you often feel at the beginning like this connection with gravity. Your body feels heavy, you're tense. But then with standing and breathing, or just even in sitting meditation, you start to feel a loosening effect. It's like the fluids start to flow. And it's as if you're no longer governed by gravity, but by levity. You feel lighter, and you feel buoyant. That's connecting with the etheric forces. You're getting a connection there. And that's, I think, awakening that inner experience. So it's not just a dry concept for you, it's an actual living thing. So that would be one exercise. Another would just be meditating on a plant growing and how it's unfolding through time, how it goes, contracts into the seed and then expands in the cotyledons, back to a contraction to a stem, expansion. And it's as if being taken hold of these extra forces, these extra activities. And so all of this is, I think, a way to start awakening that experience for people. So you're not just a hunk of matter and dead stuff that's brought to a different level organization. Again, I'm not saying there are extra physical forces, like there's no fifth force, but there are forces that come in and organize the physical forces to a higher level. So they take gravity and move it more towards levity. So fluids, they're buoyant. They take electromagnetism and bring electricity and magnetism into life. So in the case of electricity, bring it into light. In the case of magnetism, that's an image of the tone ether that's fallen into matter. So that brings more activity there. So these are different meditative things that you can do to help you, see more than just this as a dry concept that has to be memorized in some way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right. Wow, that's yeah. We all have that homework, and I don't think that homework stops.
That's a lifelong assignment, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Bringing in the good stuff and transforming, the matter in a way that's.
Yeah, I think you just said it. You're bringing matter from a dead physical state into a living state, and that's really where we get tired. Our matter has fallen into that dead physical state, and you have to then either go to sleep, remove consciousness so the life forces can now act and revivify you, or do something to reintegrate that life activity. I mean, that's one thing we can leave here is fatigue really is a sign that your life activities in one or more organs have now become depleted. Those etheric forces are no longer working adequately. And the etheric force is not something you just drink in like a drink. They're actually all around you in the cosmos, and it's more of a question of connecting to them. So when the etheric forces are weakened, it means your connection to those forces has fallen away. Now, again, through meditation, Qigong, putting needles in the skin, which are like little antennas to get that stuff in. I mean, you're connecting yourself with those cosmic forces. So, we could say the force is all around you. You have to connect with the force.
I guess it's just noticing when we're maybe not connected, and then remembering that we have this option,
right?
And these kind of life forces, if you will, or etheric forces,
yes,
or even beyond that, available to us.
That's right. That's right. And that's why going into the nature, so-called forest bathing, all these things reconnect you with those forces. And so people then begin to feel rejuvenated. You feel less of that physical gravitational influence within you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. And where I don't know who else lives in Portland, Oregon, but sometimes it's raining. We don't always feel like going outside. But
here the chemical tone ether is very strong. The light ether and warmth ethers are not very strong. So that's where people feel like they need the lights, they need the warmth. Down in the desert in the Southwest, you have just the opposite issue, right? So that's where your environment, actually, you can see the different ethers that can come through those environmental forces in a way that you can then bring into the being in this way. So yeah, that first question that we opened with about the role of technology, we can now say from this knowledge that modern technology depletes very strongly those etheric activities within us. And so we need extra exposure to those external ethers to recharge. And so that's just the notion. You sit at your computer too long, you feel tired, your brain, your inner light now is all disorganized, and so forth. And you spend some time in nature, in a way, those forces are restored. The question will come when less and less nature, unfortunately, is available to people. How living in the inner city do you connect with those forces? And it can be done. But you have to, first of all, have a knowledge of them. And then you can start to ask, how can I connect with it?
Yeah. Well, I wonder what that'll look like if it's just through advanced spiritual practices, or even just asking the question. That will be different, a different answer for everyone.
You got to know the question first, and then the answer will come.